It was a quiet evening, the kind that makes you feel the day is almost over and the world is slowing down. The sun had already set and the sky was painted in shades of purple and orange. The highway stretched out long and empty, and the only sounds were the hum of passing cars and the soft whisper of wind brushing against the trees. Officer Daniel had been driving for hours, doing his usual patrol around the outskirts of town. He had been a cop for nearly 15 years, and in all that time he had seen plenty of strange things on the road. But most nights were calm. Most nights were peaceful. He liked it that way. He leaned back in his seat, took a sip of his lukewarm coffee, and checked the clock on his dashboard. Only an hour left before his shift ended. He was already thinking about heading home, maybe catching a late dinner, when a flash of light caught his attention. A blue sedan sped past him, going faster than it should. It wasn't going dangerously fast, but something about the way it moved caught his eye. The car swerved slightly from one lane to another before correcting itself. Daniel frowned. That kind of driving usually meant one of two things. Either the driver was tired or something was wrong. He flipped on his patrol lights and followed. The blue and red lights reflected off the back of the sedan. At first, the car didn't slow down. It kept moving for a few seconds, maybe more, before finally pulling over to the side of the road. That hesitation immediately put Daniel on edge. He parked behind it, turned off his siren, and radioed his location in a calm, practiced tone. Then he stepped out. The night air was cool. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked up to the car. From the outside, it looked ordinary, a bit dusty, maybe not well cared for, but nothing unusual. He approached carefully, his flashlight in hand, the beam slicing through the dim light. Inside, the driver sat stiffly, both hands gripping the steering wheel tight. He looked like he was trying too hard to stay calm. Daniel noticed how his shoulders were slightly shaking, how his knuckles were white from pressure. "Evening," Daniel said in a steady voice. "License and registration, please." The man turned his head slowly. His eyes darted nervously between Daniel and the rearview mirror. His voice came out thin and shaky. "Sure, officer." "Yeah, of course." He started searching through the glove box, fumbling with papers, dropping a few, apologizing under his breath. Daniel watched him closely. Something wasn't right. The man looked scared. Not just anxious about a ticket, but deeply nervous, like he was hiding something. As Daniel's flashlight moved around the inside of the car, it landed briefly on the back seat. There, behind the driver, he noticed something small, a shape. It was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting very still. She was wearing a light-colored sweater, and her hair was messy, as if she'd been on the road for a while. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly. The girl didn't look at him. She was staring down at her lap, holding on to something, a small stuffed toy maybe. He thought she might just be tired or shy. But then he noticed her face. It wasn't the kind of quiet you'd expect from a sleepy child. It was the quiet of fear. A faint sound reached his ears. It wasn't loud, just a soft sniffle. The kind of sound a kid makes when trying not to cry. Daniel's stomach tightened. He turned back to the driver. "Is that your daughter?" he asked casually, his tone even. The man froze for half a second, then forced a smile. "Yes, sir. She's my niece, actually. I'm just driving her home from her aunt's place." Daniel nodded slowly, studying him. "She okay?" "Oh, yes," the man said quickly. "Just tired. Long day," but Daniel wasn't convinced. The man's voice was trembling again, and his eyes kept flicking to the mirror, checking on the girl. The more he talked, the more uneasy Daniel felt. Something about the way the girl sat there, too still, too quiet, didn't sit right. He decided to keep it calm. "All right," he said. "Just hang tight for me a minute." He stepped back toward his patrol car, his mind already racing. Once inside, he quietly radioed dispatch and gave them the license plate number. A few moments later, the reply came through. The plate didn't match the vehicle's registration. That was another red flag. Daniel exhaled slowly. He looked back at the car. The driver was still sitting there, staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. The girl hadn't moved an inch. He returned to the car window. "Mind stepping out for a moment?" he asked. The man hesitated. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I just need to ask you a few questions," Daniel replied, his tone firm but calm. "Standard procedure." After a long pause, the man opened the door and stepped out. He looked uneasy, glancing around like he was searching for an escape route. Daniel noticed sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night. "Where did you say you were heading?" Daniel asked. Home," the man said quickly. "Just home." "Where's home?" South side, near the old mill. Daniel studied him quietly. His answers were too vague, too uncertain. The man's voice trembled every time he spoke, and he kept wringing his hands. What's her name? Daniel asked suddenly, nodding toward the car. The man blinked. Who? The girl in the back. Oh, yeah, her name's Lily. Daniel tilted his head. Lily, huh? Yeah, Lily. He held the man's gaze for a few seconds. Something about the hesitation in his tone made Daniel's pulse pick up. He turned slightly, leaned down, and looked toward the car again. The girl was watching them now, her small face pale in the dim light. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that instant Daniel saw something. Fear, confusion, maybe a silent plea. He gave her a gentle smile. Hey there, sweetheart, he said softly. You okay? The man shifted quickly. She's fine, he interrupted. She's just shy. Doesn't talk much to strangers. Daniel straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Mind if I ask her myself? The man hesitated again. She's tired. She needs rest. Daniel didn't argue. He simply gave a small nod and said, All right. Wait here for a second. Then he walked back to his cruiser, his thoughts now racing faster than ever. Inside, he picked up his radio again and quietly called for backup, keeping his tone even so the man wouldn't suspect anything. He reported a possible child endangerment situation, explaining the mismatched registration and the driver's nervous behavior. Dispatch confirmed that an officer nearby was already on the way. Daniel looked up again at the sedan. The driver was pacing slightly, pretending to stretch his legs but never stepping too far from the car. Daniel could see his tension building. A few minutes passed that felt like hours. The road was quiet, just the sound of crickets and the faint rumble of cars far in the distance. Then finally another patrol car appeared, pulling up behind Daniel's vehicle. Relief washed over him. But even before backup arrived, something inside Daniel told him that this was not just a simple case. The way that little girl had looked at him, scared but hopeful, was burned into his mind. He stepped out again and walked toward the sedan one more time. The other officer stayed a few steps behind, watching carefully. Daniel opened the back door slightly, just enough to crouch beside it. The girl turned her head slowly. Her eyes were glassy and her small fingers clutched that worn-out toy tightly. Hey, Daniel said softly, keeping his voice gentle, almost like a whisper. What's your name, sweetheart? She hesitated. For a second, she looked toward the front seat as if afraid the man might hear her. Then she looked back at Daniel. Her voice was barely audible, just a soft, trembling whisper. My name's Katie? Daniel froze for a second. That wasn't the name the driver had given. He gave her a small nod, his heart beating faster. Okay, Katie, he said quietly, you're doing great. Everything's okay now. He stood up slowly and looked over at his fellow officer. Their eyes met and Daniel didn't need to say a word. They both knew something was terribly wrong. The driver's story didn't add up and the girl's fear confirmed it. What had started as a simple traffic stop was now something far more serious. As Daniel walked back to the front of the car, his mind was already working through the possibilities. Who was this man? Why did he lie about the girl's name? And why did the license plate not match? He didn't know all the answers yet. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let that car drive away until he found out the truth. He glanced one more time at the little girl sitting quietly in the back seat. This time she wasn't looking down anymore. She was looking at him, straight at him, with eyes that seemed to be silently asking for help. And in that single look, Daniel knew his night was far from over. Something deep inside told him this stop was going to change everything. The second police car stopped quietly behind Daniel's cruiser. Its headlights dimmed and the officer inside stepped out carefully, walking toward Daniel. They exchanged a few low words, nothing loud enough for the man by the blue sedan to hear. The night air felt heavier now, almost still, as if it knew something big was about to happen. Daniel nodded slightly toward the car. Keep an eye on him, he murmured. I'm going to talk to the kid again. The other officer positioned himself near the driver, pretending it was just a normal check, but Daniel could tell the man was getting more and more restless. He kept looking toward the highway, tapping his foot, his body tensed like he was ready to run. Daniel went back to the backseat window and crouched down again. The little girl, Katie, was still clutching that small toy in her lap. When she saw Daniel, her eyes softened just a little, like she wanted to trust him but wasn't sure if she could. Hey there, Daniel said softly. You doing okay? She nodded slowly but didn't say a word. Can I ask you something? He continued, keeping his voice calm and gentle. You said your name is Katie, right? She nodded again. Do you know the man driving the car? She hesitated. Her small fingers twisted the edge of her blanket. She glanced toward the front seat, then back at Daniel. Her lips parted, and for a second it seemed like she was about to speak. But then she shook her head very slightly, a nervous, almost invisible movement. Daniel's chest tightened. He could tell she was scared. The kind of fear that runs deep. The kind that makes a kid go quiet. He gave her a reassuring smile. It's okay, he whispered. You don't have to be afraid. You're safe now, all right? She didn't answer, but a tear rolled down her cheek. Daniel wanted to reach out, but he didn't. He knew he had to handle it carefully. He stood up again and walked back to the driver, who was now talking nervously to the other officer. His voice was shaky, his hands moving too much. He was telling some story about picking up his niece from her aunt's place, but every sentence seemed to change a little from the last one. Mind if I take a look inside the car? Daniel asked, his tone polite but firm. The man froze. What for? Just a quick safety check, Daniel said. It's standard procedure when there's a child in the car during a stop like this. The man's lips twitched. You don't need to. Everything's fine. Daniel gave him a calm, steady look. Sir, I'm asking nicely. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. The man hesitated again, then gave a small, forced laugh. Fine, go ahead. Daniel walked to the passenger side, shining his flashlight across the floor, the seat, the back area. There wasn't much to see at first. A few snack wrappers, a plastic bottle, an old jacket. But then he noticed something strange. On the floor near the driver's seat was a folded map, with red markings drawn over several towns. He picked it up carefully and looked closer. There were circles around certain locations, grocery stores, parks, even a few schools. It didn't make sense at first, but Daniel's instincts told him it wasn't good. He walked back to the man holding the map. You've been traveling around a lot, huh? The man's eyes flickered. Yeah, just for work. Delivery stuff, Daniel tilted his head. Delivery? What kind? The man looked away. Just stuff. Furniture, small jobs. It was obvious he was making it up as he went. The more he spoke, the more nervous he got. His voice cracked and his hands trembled again. Daniel took a slow step closer. Mind if I ask again where you said your niece's family lives? The man opened his mouth but didn't answer. His breathing grew heavier, and for a brief moment he looked toward the highway again. That same nervous glance Daniel had seen before. The other officer noticed too. Sir, please stay where you are, he said firmly. The man froze again, his jaw tightening. Daniel could see the panic behind his eyes. He'd seen it before, that look people get when they know they're caught. Daniel lowered his voice. I'm going to be honest with you, he said calmly. Something here doesn't add up, and I'm giving you a chance to tell me the truth before this gets worse. Who is that little girl? The man swallowed hard. His face went pale. I told you, he said, his voice shaky. She's my niece. Daniel held his gaze unmoving. Then tell me her mother's name. That question hit like a brick. The man froze completely, his mouth half open, no sound coming out. A few seconds passed. Then he stammered, You don't have the right to ask me that. Daniel stepped back slightly. Sir, we're past that point. He gave a small nod to the other officer, signaling him to move closer. The man looked from one to the other, realizing he was running out of options. His breathing quickened and he started backing toward the car. Sir, Daniel warned, don't do anything stupid. The man's hand twitched, but he didn't reach for anything. He just looked terrified, trapped between the officers and the dark road ahead. Finally, his shoulders slumped. I didn't do anything, he said quietly. Daniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked toward the back seat again, crouched down beside the girl and spoke softly.
Katie, can you tell me where you're from?
She stared at him for a moment, then whispered, I want to go home. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Where's home, sweetheart? She hesitated, then said a small town's name, one Daniel recognized instantly. It was over 50 miles away. That detail alone shattered the man's story completely. He stood up slowly and looked at the other officer. We need to detain him, he said quietly. The officer nodded. They both moved carefully, not wanting to startle the man. But before they could say anything more, the man spoke up again, his voice trembling. Look, I wasn't trying to hurt her. he said quickly. Daniel cut him off. Save it. We'll talk about that at the station. The man looked down, defeated. The other officer moved behind him, securing his wrists gently but firmly. The man didn't resist. He just hung his head. While that was happening, Daniel opened the back door again and knelt down beside the little girl. You're safe now, he said softly. No one's going to hurt you. We're taking you somewhere safe, okay? She nodded, tears filling her eyes again. Can I see my mom? Daniel's heart ached. We'll find her, he promised. I'll make sure you do. He took off his jacket and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. The night air was cold and she was shivering. He guided her out of the car carefully, holding her hand. She looked small and fragile under the flashing lights, her face pale but her eyes full of quiet hope. As Daniel led her toward his patrol car, she looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you." Those two little words hit him harder than anything else that night. He gave her a soft smile. "You're welcome, kiddo." He helped her into the back seat of his cruiser and made sure she was warm. Then he closed the door and turned back toward the other officer, who was finishing the arrest. They exchanged a quick nod, no words needed. They both knew how serious this had become. Once the man was in custody, Daniel radioed dispatch again. He reported the incident and requested they check for any missing child reports from the town the girl mentioned. The dispatcher's voice came back after a few moments, quieter this time. "Copy that," she said. "We have a missing child alert from that town. Matches the age and description you just gave." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs for a second. It was true. She really was missing. And somehow, by chance or fate, he had found her. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at the road ahead. His hands rested on the wheel, but his mind was elsewhere. What if he hadn't stopped that car? What if he'd just driven past thinking it was nothing? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He looked in the rearview mirror. The little girl was sitting quietly, wrapped in his jacket, watching the passing lights. Her toy rested on her lap again, but her grip wasn't as tight now. She looked calmer, safer. Daniel smiled faintly. "You're gonna be okay," he said softly, almost to himself. The drive back to the station was long and the night felt endless. But for the first time in hours, Daniel didn't feel tired. He felt alert, awake, and strangely grateful. Because tonight doing his job had meant more than just enforcing the law. It had meant saving a life. The girl leaned her head against the window, eyes heavy as if sleep was finally winning. Daniel kept glancing at her through the mirror, making sure she was all right. And as the quiet road stretched ahead, he couldn't shake one thought from his mind. Something deep and unexplainable. That sometimes the smallest decision, like pulling over one suspicious car, can change everything. The ride back to the station was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of the car engine was the only sound filling the space between them. The girl sat in the back seat, wrapped in Daniel's jacket, her small hands clutching the stuffed toy she had held the entire time. Every few minutes, Daniel would glance at her through the rearview mirror. She wasn't asleep, but her eyes were heavy, her face pale and tired. He didn't want to scare her with too many questions, not yet. She had already been through enough. Right now, all that mattered was keeping her safe. When they finally reached the station, the lights outside flickered softly, breaking the stillness of the night. Daniel parked the car and turned to her. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently. "We're here. You're safe now, okay?" She nodded quietly, eyes darting around as if unsure where she was. Daniel got out, walked around, and opened the door for her. The cool air hit her face, and she shivered a little, but she held his hand when he offered it. That small gesture said more than words ever could. Inside, the station was calm. Only a few officers were around, finishing paperwork or heading home for the night. When they saw Daniel walk in with a child wrapped in his jacket, everyone paused. They could tell right away that this wasn't just a routine case. He led the girl to a chair near his desk. "You want some water?" he asked. She nodded again, so he poured her a cup from the cooler and handed it to her. She took tiny sips, both hands gripping the paper cup like it was the most precious thing in the world. While she sat quietly, Daniel stepped aside and talked to the officer on duty. "We've got a missing child," he said in a low voice. Dispatch confirmed her description matches one from the alert earlier today. The other officer nodded and quickly began checking the system. "Let's make sure she's the..." "Same one." Daniel glanced back at her. She was sitting with her feet barely touching the floor, staring at the badge on his desk as if trying to read it. She looked so small there, surrounded by police equipment, reports, and radios. A few minutes later, the officer turned back. "You're right," he said. "It's her." The report came in from a town 50 miles away. Parents have been searching since yesterday morning. Daniel's chest tightened with relief. He had found her in time. "Her name's Katie Evans," the officer continued. "Age 6. Went missing near a grocery store. They've been running searches all day." Daniel looked down at her again. Katie. The name fit her somehow. Quiet, gentle. But now that he knew who she was, it made everything even heavier. Someone out there had been living a nightmare for the past 24 hours, and here she was, sitting quietly in a small-town police station, not yet knowing she was finally safe. He knelt down beside her again. "Katie," he said softly, "I need to ask you something important, okay? You don't have to be scared. You did really good tonight." She looked at him, her eyes still uncertain but curious. "That man who was driving," he continued. "How do you know him?" She hesitated for a long moment. Then in a small voice she whispered, "I don't." Daniel swallowed hard. "You've never seen him before?" She shook her head. "He said he'd help me find my mom, but he didn't." That was all she said, but it was enough. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, taking in a deep breath. He had to be careful now, calm and patient. The last thing he wanted was to make her relive something painful. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You don't have to say anything else right now. You're safe here. We're going to get your mom, I promise." She nodded again, her lips trembling just a little. He gave her a reassuring smile and stood up. Meanwhile, the other officers were handling the man they had arrested. He was sitting in one of the holding rooms, silent, head down. Daniel didn't go in to see him yet. There would be time for questions later. Right now, all his focus was on the girl. The next step was clear. They needed to contact her family. Daniel called dispatch again, asking them to reach out to the local department where the missing report was filed. The minutes that followed felt longer than hours. Katie sat quietly in the corner, drawing on a scrap of paper one of the officers had given her. She wasn't drawing anything specific, just lines and shapes, but it seemed to calm her. Every once in a while, she'd look up to make sure Daniel was still nearby. Each time he caught her glance, he smiled back just to remind her she wasn't alone. Then finally, the call came through. Her mother had been found. She was on her way, escorted by local authorities driving through the night to get there. When Daniel heard that, a wave of relief washed over him. He looked at the clock, almost 2 a.m. It would still be a few hours before she arrived. He decided to stay with Katie the whole time. He brought her a small blanket from the lost and found bin, and she curled up in one of the chairs, her stuffed toy tucked close. The soft glow of the desk lamp made the room feel warmer. As she began to drift towards sleep, Daniel sat nearby, quietly writing his report. But every few lines he found himself stopping and looking at her, that little face finally peaceful. He couldn't help but think of his own daughter, who was about the same age. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently. What if he hadn't been paying attention? What if he'd ignored that car? The idea sent a chill down his spine. The hours passed slowly. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. Inside, the hum of the computers and the faint ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. Then, just before sunrise, the door opened. Daniel looked up. A woman rushed inside, her eyes red and tired but full of desperate hope. One look at the little girl and she let out a cry, a sound of pure relief. "Katie!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The girl woke instantly, blinking as she turned toward the voice. For a moment, she seemed unsure if she was dreaming. Then she saw her mother and jumped from the chair, running across the room. Daniel stood up and stepped back, giving them space. The mother dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms tightly around her daughter. Both of them were crying, holding each other like they'd never let go again. The entire station seemed to fall silent, the moment too powerful for anyone to interrupt. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He turned away slightly, letting them have their moment. He'd seen a lot during his career: accidents, loss, heartbreak. But this was different. This was one of those rare moments that reminded him why he did what he did. When the mother finally looked up, her face streaked with tears, she spotted him. She stood still, holding Katie close, and walked over. "You found her," she said in a trembling voice. You brought her back to me. Daniel smiled faintly. I just did my job, ma'am. But she shook her head. No, she said, tears still falling. You saved my little girl. I'll never forget that. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Sometimes words weren't enough. Katie turned to him too. Thank you, she whispered again, her voice small but full of meaning. Daniel smiled softly. You're welcome, sweetheart. You just stay safe, all right? She nodded, her hand still gripping her mother's tightly. After they left for the hospital to make sure she was okay, Daniel sat back at his desk, staring at the empty chair where she'd been sitting only minutes before. The quiet felt heavier now, but not in a bad way, more like a kind of peace. Later that morning, he went to check on the suspect again. The man was silent, avoiding eye contact, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth would come out soon. The important thing was that Katie was home. By the time Daniel finally stepped outside, the sun was rising over the town, casting golden light across the empty parking lot. He took a deep breath, feeling the chill fade from the air. It had been one long night, tense, emotional, and unforgettable. He knew he'd remember that little girl's face for the rest of his life. He didn't need medals or headlines. The look in her eyes when she realized she was safe, that was enough. As he got into his patrol car again, ready to head home for a few hours of rest, he glanced at the passenger seat. Her small blanket was still there. He picked it up and folded it neatly. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something deep, a mix of exhaustion, relief, and quiet gratitude. Sometimes being in the right place at the right time was more than luck. Sometimes it was something you couldn't explain, like fate lending a hand. And as he drove off into the morning light, he couldn't help but smile faintly. Because somewhere out there, a little girl was back in her mother's arms, and that, he thought, made every second of that night worth it. The man in the blue car was now handcuffed beside the road, sitting on the edge of the curb, breathing heavily as the flashing lights from 2 police cars lit up the night. The little girl was sitting quietly inside the patrol car, wrapped in a large police jacket. Her small fingers clutched the fabric tightly as she kept looking around, as if afraid the man would come near her again. The officer who had first stopped the car stood a few feet away, watching everything carefully. He kept thinking about the way the girl had whispered her name, the way her voice had trembled as she said she didn't know the man who was driving. The whole moment replayed in his mind again and again. It felt unreal. What if he hadn't stopped that car? What if he had just let it go by because it didn't seem too serious? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He stepped away from the suspect and spoke softly into his radio, calling the dispatcher. I need confirmation, he said. Check the name of the child again. She says she was taken from outside a grocery store 2 days ago. The dispatcher went silent for a few seconds, typing quickly. Then her voice came back a little shaky this time. Confirmed. The missing child alert that went out yesterday. Same name, same age, same description. You found her. For a moment, the officer just stood there, staring at the dark sky. Relief hit him, but so did a heavy wave of emotion he didn't expect. He had been in the force for years, seen all kinds of things, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about saving someone's whole life. He walked back to the patrol car and knelt down beside the open door. The girl's eyes lifted to meet his. You're safe now, he said softly. We're taking you home soon. She didn't say anything, but a single tear rolled down her cheek. The officer handed her a small bottle of water and said, Your mom's been looking everywhere for you. She'll be so happy to see you. The little girl nodded slowly, still unsure whether it was really over. He gently closed the door, and the other officer came over to update him. We checked the car, the younger officer said quietly. There are some things you'll want to see. They walked together to the blue sedan. The inside looked messy, fast food wrappers, a map, an old blanket, and a few papers scattered on the passenger seat. But what caught their attention was the backpack lying on the floor near the back seat. Inside, they found a few children's items, a toy, a small notebook, and a photograph of another child they didn't recognize. Along with those, there were 2 fake IDs, a phone with no SIM card, and a bundle of cash wrapped in an elastic band. The older officer frowned as he looked through the evidence. The more he saw, the clearer it became that this man had been planning something much bigger than just one crime. He didn't want to think about what could have happened next if they hadn't stopped him in time. When they returned to the station, the little girl was sitting quietly, holding a cup of warm cocoa that one of the female officers had given her. The room was calm, but the air still carried the tension of what had happened. Detectives arrived to question the man while others began tracing the car's history. The officer stayed near the child, making sure she wasn't left alone. He didn't ask her too many questions. She'd already been through enough. But after a while, she began to talk softly, as if letting go of some of the fear. She said she had been walking with her mother outside a grocery store when the man approached her. He told her he knew her mother and offered to help carry something. Then, before she could understand what was happening, she was in the car and everything went dark. The officer listened carefully but didn't interrupt. He knew every detail mattered, but more than that, he wanted her to feel heard. "You did nothing wrong," he said gently. "You were very brave." A few hours later, the detectives confirmed what they had feared. The man in custody was already wanted in 2 nearby states for similar crimes. He had changed his name multiple times and moved from one place to another, always staying just far enough ahead of the law. But now, with the evidence found in the car and the child's statement, there was no escape for him this time. The officer watched as they led the man away in handcuffs. The suspect didn't say much, only kept his head low, eyes fixed on the floor. The officer didn't feel anger, just a quiet sadness that people like that existed in the world. Outside the station, dawn was breaking. The night's chill began to fade as soft orange light touched the horizon. The officer took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The city was waking up, but for him it felt like the longest night of his career was finally ending. Then, his radio buzzed again. The dispatcher's voice came through, warmer this time. "The girl's mother is on her way. She's been notified." He nodded silently and turned toward the little girl, who was now sitting beside one of the female officers, drawing something on a piece of paper with colored pencils. She had stopped shaking. Her eyes looked calmer now, though still tired. When the mother arrived, the sound of her footsteps running down the hallway echoed through the station. She pushed through the door, calling her daughter's name. The little girl looked up, and for a split second, both froze. Then the child jumped up from her chair and ran straight into her mother's arms. The officer stepped back, letting them have their moment. The mother held her daughter tightly, sobbing and thanking every person in uniform she could see. The whole room went quiet except for the sound of her crying in relief. It was the kind of moment that made all the long nights and hard calls worth it. The officer stood by the doorway, quietly wiping his eyes before anyone could notice. He wasn't the kind of man who showed emotion easily, but seeing that reunion hit something deep inside him. Later, when the paperwork was done and the detectives had taken the suspect away for further questioning, the officer sat alone in his patrol car for a while. The sun was now high in the sky, warming the dashboard. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror and shook his head slowly, still trying to process everything. He thought about how ordinary the evening had started. Just another shift. Just another driver who seemed to be in a hurry. And yet, that one small decision, to turn on his lights and pull the car over, had changed everything. He thought about the girl's quiet face, the way she had clung to his jacket, and how fragile life could be. There were so many moments in his job that people never saw. The doubt, the fear, the endless waiting. But once in a while, something happened that reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. A few days later, the case made headlines across local news. Reporters wanted interviews, people were calling him a hero, but when they asked for a comment, he simply said, "I just did what any officer would have done." That night, as he was preparing for another shift, he found an envelope on his desk. It was from the mother. Inside, there was a handwritten note that said, "You gave me my world back. Thank you for stopping that car." Tucked inside the note was a small drawing. It was a picture of a police car, a tall man standing beside it, and a small girl holding his hand. At the bottom, written in bright crayon, were the words, "Thank you for saving me." He smiled as he looked at it, feeling his throat tighten. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it inside his locker. That little piece of paper meant more to him than any award or recognition could ever mean. From that day on, every time he went on patrol and saw a car speeding by or a situation that didn't feel right, he remembered that night. He remembered that sometimes a single stop can change a life, and sometimes it can even save one. The police station had gone quiet after the chaos of that night. Most of the officers had gone home, but the one who made the traffic stop stayed a little longer. He sat at his desk staring at the small drawing the little girl had given him earlier that day. The drawing was simple, just a few stick figures, a car, and a big yellow sun, but it carried a meaning that words couldn't describe. It was a reminder that sometimes even a small act can change the course of someone's entire life. He took a slow breath, leaned back in his chair, and thought about how quickly things had changed. Just hours before, he'd been driving along an empty highway, thinking about heading home for dinner. Now that same night felt like it belonged to another lifetime. He had seen fear, relief, tears, and gratitude all in the span of one evening. And somewhere in all of that, he'd found a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. Later that morning, he finally drove home. The roads were quiet, the sun was rising, and the sky was painted in soft shades of orange. As he passed the same stretch of road where he'd stopped that blue car, he slowed down. The memory came rushing back. The flashing lights, the man's nervous face, and the frightened little girl in the back seat. It still didn't feel real. He parked by the side of the road for a moment, rolled down his window, and just sat there. The morning air was cold, but it felt fresh. He thought about how fragile life could be, how easily one decision could mean the difference between disaster and safety. He knew that the girl would now be with her family, safe in her mother's arms, probably sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. That thought alone made everything he'd gone through worth it. At home, he tried to rest, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept replaying the scene. The way she'd clutched his hand when they reached the station. The way her mother's voice had cracked when she saw her daughter again. He wasn't used to moments like that. His job usually dealt with tough situations, accidents, arguments, stolen cars. But this was something else entirely. This time it wasn't just a case report. It was a story that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Over the next few days, the story spread across town. The local news ran the headline, "Police Officer Rescues Missing Girl During Routine Stop." The story quickly reached the neighboring cities. People started calling him a hero. Some came to the station just to shake his hand or drop off thank you letters. But every time someone praised him, he'd smile politely and say, "Anyone in my place would have done the same." Deep down, though, he knew how easily things could have gone differently. He could have ignored that car. He could have let it drive off, thinking it was just another tired driver. But something about that night, something about the man's eyes, the tension in the air, had made him trust his instincts. A few days later, he received an invitation to a small community event. It was being held by the little girl's family. They wanted to thank the officers who had helped bring her home. At first, he wasn't sure if he should go. He didn't like attention, and he never felt comfortable being in the spotlight. But something inside told him to show up, not as a hero, but as someone who had simply cared enough to act. When he arrived, the girl's mother greeted him at the door. Her eyes were still red from crying, but this time they were tears of joy, not fear. "You saved my child," she said softly. "I don't have words to thank you." He tried to speak but couldn't find the right words. Instead, he nodded, his voice catching as he said, "I'm just glad she's safe." The little girl came running into the room a few moments later, holding a small stuffed bear. She ran up to him and gave him a quick hug around his leg. "Hi," she said, smiling shyly. "Mom said you're the police who found me." He crouched down to her level, smiling back. "Yeah," he said gently. "I just wanted to make sure you got home." She held up her stuffed bear and said proudly, "This is my best friend. His name is Mr. Buttons. He's not scared anymore." He chuckled softly, touched by the innocence in her words. "That's good," he said. "It's okay to not be scared now. You're home." The girl's mother watched from the side, tears filling her eyes again. The officers stayed for a short while, meeting some of the neighbors and family members who had all gathered to celebrate. There was laughter, food, and a feeling of warmth that filled the room. It wasn't grand or fancy. It was just people coming together out of gratitude and relief. At one point, the girl's grandfather approached him. He was an older man with a firm handshake and kind eyes. "I worked in law enforcement once," he said quietly. "I know what it feels like to carry stories like this inside you. You did more than your duty that night. You followed your heart." The officer nodded slowly, understanding exactly what the old man meant. In his line of work, you often had to rely on instinct. Training could prepare you for many things, but not for the moments when your heart told you something your mind couldn't explain. When the event ended, the little girl's mother handed him a small wrapped box. "Please," she said, "take this. It's just a small thank you." He tried to refuse, but she insisted. When he opened it later that night, he found a framed picture of the little girl smiling, holding her stuffed bear. At the bottom, she had written in bright colors, "Thank you for bringing me home." He placed the frame on his desk, right next to the drawing she had given him before. Every time he looked at them, he felt a quiet sense of pride. Not the kind that came from praise or recognition, but the kind that comes from knowing you made a difference when it truly mattered. Months passed and life went back to normal. He returned to his daily shifts, the usual calls, the quiet nights on patrol. But something in him had changed. He noticed things more, the small details, the worried faces, the moments people overlooked. He realized that his job wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about protecting the lives that depended on those rules. Sometimes, late at night, he'd still drive past the same stretch of road where everything had happened. The memory would come flooding back, and he'd feel the same mix of fear and relief. But now there was also a sense of calm that came with it, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, good could still win. He never told many people about what that night meant to him. But deep inside, he carried it like a quiet promise, to always listen to his instincts, to never dismiss that small voice that says something isn't right, because that night had proven that sometimes, one small decision can save an entire future. One evening, about 6 months later, while he was finishing a shift, he saw a familiar face near the station gate. It was the little girl and her mother. The girl had grown a bit taller, her hair neatly tied back, a bright smile on her face. She was holding something behind her back. When she saw him, she ran over, calling his name. "I made you something," she said, holding out a folded piece of paper. He knelt down to take it. On the paper, she had drawn another picture. This one showed a police car, a small girl waving beside it, and the words written in colorful letters. "My hero friend." He smiled, blinking back the emotion that rose in his chest. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll keep it safe." The girl's mother smiled. "She's doing better now," she said. "Nightmares have stopped. She's even going back to school next week." "That's wonderful," he said, truly meaning it. "She's brave. You both are." They talked for a few minutes, just small, kind words exchanged between people who would forever share a story that changed all their lives. When they left, the officer stood there for a while, watching them walk away hand in hand. The sunset painted the sky gold, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt peaceful. That night, as he drove home, the framed picture and the drawing sat safely in his bag. He looked out at the empty highway and smiled. He didn't know what other challenges life would bring, but he knew one thing for sure: he'd always remember that night, the night he followed his instinct, the night a frightened little girl looked at him with trust, the night a simple traffic stop became the moment that changed everything. And every time he thought about it, he whispered the same quiet truth to himself. Sometimes, being in the right place at the right time isn't luck, it's purpose.